From simulations in physics and ASICs to risk modeling in DeFi, how has your early technical background shaped the way that you think about economic and security risk in decentralized systems?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. So I think the kind of interesting thing about crypto research in general is that it generally tends to be pretty interdisciplinary, where, a lot of the ideas that have stuck around the longest have, maybe they were sort of discovered or implemented first in cryptocurrency systems, but they have a lot of analogies in other different parts of the world. And I think coming into this space with a more holistic, open-minded approach versus like this is one way of doing things that I've learned that everything must fit into my I have a round peg, everything must be a round hole type of thing, like really kind of getting stuck with that attitude I think generally doesn't work because in crypto the security mindset just changes depending on the products, changes depending on usage, changing depending on, you know, what the current landscape is in terms of what trade-offs people are willing to make. And those are always changing, right? If I think about crypto 10 years ago, it was, the the biggest application, on chain was minting ERC-20s, right? We're sort of like around in the beginning of the ICO boom. And realistically, there was very little you could do on chain. You could transfer tokens, you could certainly get hacked, right? There were certainly many security vulnerabilities, but they were all pure code vulnerabilities, like 1 + 1 = 3, where I put 2 coins in and I can take 3 coins out, like a re-entrancy. But then, flash forward to 2018, 2019, you had DeFi grow. Now there are these applications where the applications interact with the security of the network and could actually reduce the security of the network. And, fast forward to now, people are using sort of delegated wallet services, third-party wallet services, because they want a mobile experience. And that introduces a totally new set of actors. And so I think being flexible and being able to be adaptable with the times and how security changes is actually really important for longevity in the space. Whereas I think, if you're extremely rigid, it can oftentimes you might get stuck in a local minima.
And Gauntlet started as a ratings agency-like project for DeFi and then evolved into a simulation-based risk and parameter optimization engine. Can you walk us through that pivot and what you learned about the biggest gaps in protocol safety along the way?
Yeah, so I'd say we have sort of three phases. So, when we were started in 2018, um, we were at that time there were a bunch of new layer ones that were going to launch. There was no DeFi. I guess arguably Maker existed, but it was barely existed. Uniswap didn't exist. Probably the Uniswap contracts weren't even written until a few months later. And at that time, all of the economic risk in protocols was in layer ones. Like, how should they choose their inflation curve? How should they price transactions? Because if they price transactions too cheaply, they might incentivize spam and or make certain applications cost a lot more. But if they sort of price in a more expensive manner, then you might be limiting the set of applications that are feasible for users. In DeFi, you had the first sort of test of this in practice. But I think in 2018, it was sort of a like anything can happen type of moment. And what we were focused on is, hey, how do you take tools where people have assessed these risks in other fields, namely in traditional finance, and try to build tools to do that? So a lot of that tooling is like simulation software, backtesting software, stress testing different models of agents in the system. And so that was sort of what we were focused on 2018 to 2020. Although we were mainly focused on doing it for different types of customers, everyone from layer ones to the early DeFi protocols. And we wrote a lot of research that kind of had to justify like why this methodology is useful in crypto, not just in other fields. By 2020, it became clear that in DeFi, there was a very clear notion of economic security. Just having a code audit was not sufficient because the type of collateral you use might change over time. The Oracle quality might change over time. There's not like a one-shot assessment. These things are constantly changing depending on market conditions, depending on interactions with other blockchains, centralized exchanges. And it became clear you needed sort of more of a like hybrid approach where you had monitoring and continuous updates, every week, every day, mixed in with sort of like more continuous security assessments. And so, we focused on that. It's like, how do you choose collateral factors so that people can't drain the protocol? And, I think from 2020 to 2024, really cut our teeth on that. We're in war rooms and in a lot of the big incidents. And then 2024, we started running vaults. So we currently run a little under $2 billion in vaults. And basically, vault management is a little bit like managing a protocol. So it's kind of taking the kind of work we did before, where we're you know providing updates to protocols and now kind of directly doing it ourselves. So I think we evolved from starting on the security side to sort of more moving closer to the asset management side. And I think a lot of the reason for that is crypto kind of evolved, right? And so, you naturally evolve with where the market's moving.
In your view, what are the most underappreciated economic risks in DeFi today? And how would you communicate that complexity to governance communities that are often non-technical?
Yeah, I think there's sort of some types of risks that have always been known, but I think people sort of maybe overly transferred the value of the risk to a new environment. So an example of this is Oracle quality. Like an Oracle for Ethereum or Bitcoin provided by a provider can be very different from an Oracle for a much lower liquidity asset provided by the same provider. And there's currently a huge move to get real world assets on chain. But the Oracle quality for real world assets, regardless of provider, is fundamentally just worse than um, crypto assets themselves, right? Because crypto assets are sufficiently liquid. There's a lot of venues. It's really hard to kind of like corner the market enough and manipulate the market enough to swing the Oracle for a lot certain types of assets. And so I think one of the biggest risks overall is just like managing Oracle quality and Oracle behavior still, even though like, this is a risk that's always been true in the beginning, so from the beginning in lending and perpetuals. I think it's just more, as people want to bring more assets on chain that are atypical, the oracles still serve as a vantage point for risk. I think the second thing is that hasn't been as big of a problem in, let's say, DeFi 1.0, but I think in the current DeFi environment, it's much more of an issue is sort of duration risk and portfolio level risk. I think the original DeFi protocols kind of chose extremely conservative settings, which obviously were not very competitive with centralized competitors, but also kind of in the process didn't have as much of this type of portfolio type of risk of like whole protocol level risk. They were sort of choosing setups that minimize the total protocol risk at the expense of yield. And I think right now, obviously, we're seeing much more. You've seen centralized perpetuals and spot volume and lending volume grow to 10 to 20% of what the decentralized volumes and AUM is sort of 10 to 20% of what the centralized is, which is huge growth over the last few years since 2022, since FTX's failure. And that growth came because people made slightly different risk trade-offs and different risk management trade-offs for getting higher yields that were competitive with CeFi. And so in that shift, you now went from having a lot more isolated risk to a lot more protocol level risk. You also have more of this duration management and liquidity risk. And I think that's why you sort of have seen, newer protocols kind of give different types of roles to participants, things like Morpho and Camino and stuff, have sort of different permissioning systems and different sort of actors doing different functions. Whereas I think, in the classical DeFi market, especially, in DeFi lending or, DEXs, there were sort of three types of actors. There's a borrower, a lender, and a liquidator. Now there's, a lot more roles. And, with increasing complexity comes increasing security and risk. So, there's no free lunch, right? You want higher yield, you're going to have to stomach that.
Looking forward, how do you see the role of simulation and quantitative risk infrastructure evolving as crypto scales, especially with new paradigm shifts like restaking, DAOs managing institutional scale treasuries, and increasingly algorithmic governance?
Yeah, so I actually think the examples you talked about in terms of more on-chain native usage, I think there's more comfort in the risk levels and the trade-offs that are being made. To be honest, I think that people who are on-chain native have lived through, a number of financial disasters and survive. And if they're still surviving, then they've like learned something, right? I think the bigger question to me is actually how do you handle new users, like the institutional users who, they just dip their toes into stablecoins and now they want yield on their stablecoins, or the users who are trading real world tokenized equities on chain, or new users whose first ever crypto experience was a mobile wallet where they have a delegated wallet through an MPC service. Those users might not be familiar at all with any of these risks. And I think figuring out how to communicate the learnings of the past and why certain choices are made without overwhelming new users, to me, that's actually um, where I sort of see the biggest need in sort of education. I know it sort of doesn't exactly answer your question because I know you're talking about kind of the on-chain native users, but the on-chain native users I think are just A, have a higher risk tolerance, and B, if they're still alive, then they have learned something about the decisions they're going to make.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and then the final course. So I would love to know your security hot take or what you think, sort of generally speaking, in the realm of security and digital assets. What are people still getting wrong today?
Um, I think there was a very quick move in the last 6 months where, using AI tools for security was a joke or would be kind of made fun of, whereas I think now there's definitely a lot of serious usage. Now, I'm not saying it will, you can't replace, tools like Olympics that are doing verification and more deep testing, but I do think the the developers saying they are enabled by AI tools to have a better security understanding of their own code. I think that has just improved dramatically. And there are a lot of people, I think, in crypto in particular. I think outside of crypto, actually, this is the consensus view, but in crypto, people are still extremely tied down to the like human in the loop has found many critical bugs is like fundamentally necessary. And I think that is becoming less and less true. And maybe it's not that hot. Like I said, I don't think it's a hot take for people outside of crypto.
Mhm.
But in crypto, there's been this kind of lone wolf human auditor needs to be
Mhm.
around type of thing forever. And obviously it's in the past worked, but I think we might be crossing the Rubicon on that.